April 1945. The Seelow Heights. Fog, silence, expectancy. On the positions of the Red Army hundreds of ML-20 guns lay in ambush. In a moment the earth would begin to speak. From the sky fiery arrows would fall. The Germans did not yet know that this night would mark the end of their final defense before Berlin. They laughed. In German headquarters they believed that Soviet artillery was capable only of chaotic fire, crude and useless. Wehrmacht reports read, "Their guns make a lot of noise but rarely hit." For German officers precision was always a symbol of superiority, discipline, order. They believed that no Eastern gun could compare to their heavy SFH-18 howitzers. But in the East, behind the front line, in the snow and smoke of factories, something else was being born. There, where people did not speak loudly but simply forged steel, a weapon was being created that would change everything. It was not graceful. It was heavy, stubborn, ungainly in appearance. But inside it hid a precision the Germans could neither understand nor replicate. Many within the Red Army itself doubted, is such a bulky gun, weighing over 7 tons, necessary if it could hardly be moved without a tractor? Commanders asked, how will it fire in battle if the enemy quickly changes position? The answer did not come from offices but from the proving grounds. The first firings showed that this gun, contrary to all expectations, could strike a target at distances up to 17 kilometers. The Germans did not know that in the heart of the Soviet Union, in Perm, at the design bureau under Fyodor Petrov, a quiet race against time was underway. They tested new barrels, worked out recoil mechanisms, refined every part. Every screw, every thread was checked. Not for beauty, for accuracy. When the first batteries of ML-20 reached the front, nobody expected miracles from them. They were placed in the rear as a reserve. But very soon it became clear, their fire was different. Where other guns required dozens of rounds, the ML-20 hit on the third. Where the enemy thought he had escaped, the earth split again beneath his feet. German observers reported, Soviet artillerymen fire with astonishing precision. We can no longer predict their lines. This was the beginning of the end of the myth of inaccurate Soviet artillery. The first blows of the ML-20 sounded not simply like shots, they were a refutation of pride. In the mid-30s, when an illusion of calm still hovered over Europe, the Soviet Union already understood, the next war would be a war of engines and artillery. In the design bureau of Plant No. 172 in Motovilica a young engineer, Fyodor Petrov, was assigned to create a new heavy weapon. He understood clearly, the country needed a gun capable of piercing concrete and armor, hitting targets far beyond the horizon, while maintaining accuracy. Petrov worked without loud slogans. His workshop was cold, often without light. Metal on the lathe. Thus was born the weapon designated 152 mm howitzer gun model 1937, or simply, ML-20. The abbreviation was straightforward, Motovilica, Lavrenti, Model 20. There was no mystery in the name, but there was everything else, labor, calculation, belief in the result. The ML-20 differed from all predecessors. A long barrel, almost 9 meters, provided a high muzzle velocity for the shell, 600. A friction-type recoil brake and a hydropneumatic recuperator made the shot smooth, returning the barrel to the firing position without loss of aim. Sliding trails allowed a wider sector of fire, and a powerful muzzle brake decreased recoil by almost a third. All this was a new word for Soviet artillery. A 39-kilogram shell could penetrate a meter of concrete or tear apart the armor of a medium tank. But the designer's main pride was not power but precision. For the first time heavy ballistic tables were prepared accounting for wind, humidity, and air temperature. That turned firing into a science, and the artilleryman into an engineer. When the first serial guns rolled off the production line they were received without fanfare. No one yet knew that these steel giants would one day open the road to Berlin. Production was slow, each part demanded perfect fitting. But by the beginning of the war nearly 7,000 guns had been made, enough to arm whole artillery corps. Thus began the story of a weapon that carried two opposites within it, monstrous power and surgical accuracy. In a country where everything was decided by work and stubbornness, the ML-20 became the embodiment of the nation's character. It did not shout, did not demand recognition. It simply did its job, and it did it flawlessly. The first months of the war tested everything that had been built in peacetime. Factories were evacuated, lathes were loaded under bombardment. The ML-20s had to be assembled from parts, sometimes without manuals, with tools barely oiled and still smelling of smoke. Already on the third day after evacuation they fired at the enemy. On the approaches to Smolensk, Lieutenant Sherev's battery was ordered to cover a division's withdrawal. Of 4 guns only 2 remained. Gun crews in the snow dug their own positions and placed heavy barrels straight into the frozen ground. When German tanks emerged from the forest, the ML-20s opened fire. The first barrage struck the column. The earth convulsed, the air thick with dust. At 10 kilometers the hits fell exactly on the highway. No one then understood that this was not chance, it was a new era of accuracy. Every shot demanded the entire crew's effort. One shell weighed over 40 kilograms, and men carried them by hand until their fingers bled. But none complained. For them this was not merely a gun, it was proof that they could still strike. In the same battles the legend of the Night Craftsman was born. In December 42 on the Stalingrad front, senior technician Kopylov assembled a working ML-20 from 3 damaged ones. He worked all night by a kerosene lamp under fire. At dawn it spoke. Its first shot destroyed a German bunker that had held out for a week. Thus a gun written off as scrap became a weapon that altered the course of battle. Such episodes were not printed in newspapers. They simply happened, like the breath of the front. The ML-20 became part of the man, part of the earth, part of the war. Its barrel blackened with soot, the carriage creaked, but the sight remained steady. The trial of war did not break this weapon. On the contrary, it tempered it as steel is tempered in flame. Each battle turned the ML-20 from an engineer's construction into a symbol of endurance. And when the front moved westward, it no longer merely fired, it led the way. Summer of 43. Kursk salient. The largest battle of armored forces in history. The Germans threw forward their best, Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands. They assumed no Soviet gun could stop that tide of steel. But in the rear of the Red Army new self-propelled mounts were already standing, Su-152s with the ML-20S gun, and heavy-towed batteries. On the morning of July 12, when smoke billowed over the field between Prokhorovka and Yakovlevo, the Su-152s rolled into position. In each of them, the heart of the ML-20, enclosed in armor. The first shot and a roar swept across the plain. A direct hit, a German Tiger was torn apart from within. The second shot, a Ferdinand burst into flames like a torch. For the first time Germans saw their heavy machines destroyed by a single blow. Meanwhile, 10 kilometers back, towed ML-20s were smashing enemy artillery positions. Their shells fell with mathematical precision, destroying ammo dumps, breaking communications and supply lines. Every minute of their fire cut the Wehrmacht off from coordination, turning the offensive into chaos. After the battle a captured German officer said, "We knew the Russians were strong in spirit, but we did not know their guns fire like engineers." It was not an overstatement. By that time the ML-20 allowed firing at invisible targets, calculating data to meter accuracy. Kursk was a turning point not only in the war but in the perception of Soviet artillery. Where the enemy had previously seen crude strength, it now met reason, cold and precise. The ML-20 turned from a heavy machine into a symbol of a new science of combat. At dawn after the battle the fields were strewn with broken metal and silence. On that field a new confidence was born. Now no one doubted Soviet guns could not only destroy but also think. After Kursk Soviet artillery changed. War taught how to shoot not only farther but smarter. The ML-20 became the center of a new system where every gun was part of a vast mechanism of precision. Fire was no longer random. It was calculated like a formula. Command posts began to host maps with dozens of wind lines and pressure tables. Meteorologists transmitted humidity data, calculators worked out corrections, forward observers relayed coordinates by radio. The ML-20 listened to these figures like a heart that senses the rhythm of war. One salvo, and the objective vanished. A second, and the enemy lost the will to resist. Germans tried to understand. Their intelligence intercepted radio traffic but heard only dry numbers and commands, third square. Correction 20. Fire. They were used to thinking Soviet artillery acted chaotically, but now every gun worked like a mathematical machine. At one sector near Orsha, Captain Roskov's battery destroyed a German communications node in 12 minutes and then, without changing position, suppressed an enemy battery at 16 kilometers. Not a single shell fell empty. After the battle, a captured German gunner said, "We fired by noise, they, by formula." It was then that a new philosophy of fire was born. Soviet artillery ceased to be merely an instrument of destruction, it became a tool of thought. Complex calculations were now made in place, under fire. Artillerymen held not only shells but pencils. On dirty sheets appeared equations of wind and range, angles and corrections. Day by day accuracy improved. An error of 100 meters became 50, then 20. The enemy, used to randomness, felt fear before the predictable. Predictability meant doom. The ML-20 became a symbol of this new epoch, an era where strength and the reason of numbers united, and each hit was not merely a shot but proof that in the art of war precision is the highest form of power. April 1945. Before Berlin rose the Seelow Heights, the last ridge the Germans vowed to hold at any cost. On its slope sat concrete pillboxes, reinforced bunkers, anti-tank ditches and thousands of soldiers confident the Red Army would choke here. They did not know that at dawn the ground beneath them would cease to exist. At night the artillerymen laid sights. ML-20s stood in long rows, hidden by nets and mist. Calculators checked data, wind, pressure, range. No cry, no sound, only metal creaking and instrument clicks. At 4 a.m. rockets lit the sky. At that instant the entire front line began to speak. The din merged into one endless sound. The earth shook like a living thing. More than 1,000 guns, including hundreds of ML-20s, fired the first salvo. 40-kilogram shells flew along calculated trajectories, covering targets up to 17 kilometers away. Pillboxes collapsed, bridges folded, tanks burst into flames before they could move. German observers reported in panic, "The Russians fire as if they can see us through the ground." Every salvo was a step toward Berlin. The operation was planned for only a few days, but the artillery's strength and precision exceeded expectations. Within 24 hours the forward units had broken through the first defensive line. The ML-20s fell silent only to have barrels changed, red-hot. Their crews calculated tirelessly, without sleep, rain or rest. They knew, behind every shot stood a whole country. One day a German general watching the ruined fortifications said, "We face not an army, we face the earth itself." He was right. This was not merely fire but geography brought into motion. When the smoke cleared the heights no longer existed, only craters and charred concrete slabs remained. Yet on those ruins Soviet flags rose. Berlin was ahead, but the outcome had already been decided. On the Seelow Heights the ML-20 reached its limit, precision, power and relentlessness merged into one. Since then its name became a sentence for anyone who dared believe they could halt the Soviet advance. After the assault the artillerymen were silent. The roar still rang in their ears but inside there was quiet. The earth seemed empty. Among the scorched trenches lay bent barrels, twisted carriages, burned boxes of shells. Victory smelled of scorched earth and sweat. Hands touched every weapon, some of the crews did not survive to the end. They fired while they could stand. One shell after another until breath turned to steam. Archives keep a record. Crew number 7 continued firing despite a direct hit on their position. The commander died, but the gun did not fall silent. There are thousands of such entries. The ML-20 demanded more of a man than any other gun. The weight of the shell broke backs, the recoil tore muscles. To make one salvo required the consent of all, from the aimer to the loader. Everyone knew they might not live to the next. Yet they did not step back. Without them the gun was dead. After battle letters, photographs, little lockets were found on parapets. One belonged to a sergeant from Kazakhstan. His note contained a single sentence: "If we miss, those I love will die." That sentence became the essence of all artillery. Accuracy was valued higher than life. When the front moved on, only shadows of men and tracks of treads remained at the positions. New crews took up old guns, not knowing the names of those who had held them yesterday. Thus continued the endless relay of fire. Victory approached but was not easy. Behind every kilometer, behind every hit, stood a price measured not in steel or gunpowder but in hearts. In the hush after the thunder the ML-20 sounded like memory, heavy, truthful, eternal. When the war ended the ML-20 did not retire to rest. It remained in service like a veteran who cannot leave his post. These guns stood on Europe's borders, in Asia, at training centers, in museums and on active positions. Their barrels gathered rust but the mechanism remained alive. The ML-20 became the standard of heavy artillery. New systems were developed on its basis, up to post-war models. Abroad its design was studied carefully. Americans noted exceptional accuracy and reliability in their reports, and the Finns used it until the late 70s. The mechanism still worked, only a metallic breath was needed to turn the handwheel and hear a familiar sound. The Soviet Union's name of Fyodor Petrov became a symbol of an engineering school. His students created new calibers but they all began with the ML-20 drawings. It was not just a machine, it was a school of thought embodied in metal. At victory parades artillery veterans stood beside their guns. Among them were those who had gone with the ML-20 from Stalingrad to Berlin. They looked at the steel giants without pomp, like old comrades. Between man and machine there was a shared fate. Over time the ML-20 became part of memory. On memorials its barrel is raised to the sky, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Every child who passes by sees in it not simply a gun but a symbol of an era when man and steel were one. It survived those who created it and those who feared it. Even decades later the sound of its shot, preserved in chronicles, still quickens the heart. The ML-20 did not simply remain in history, it became history itself. At dawn over the Silo heights the fog lifts again. The earth is quiet. Only the contour of an old ML-20 remains dark on the horizon, left as a monument. A veteran stands nearby, gray-haired, in a worn greatcoat. He does not speak. He listens. And it seems that in that silence the far-off roar of a salvo still sounds. This gun lived through the war but the war did not leave it. Its barrel holds the story, metal that remembered cold, tension, fire. Once it spoke the language of death, now it speaks the language of memory. German commanders who survived that night later confessed, "We did not understand how they could fire so accurately. It seemed the earth itself was shooting." And this was true. The ML-20 became the voice of an earth that rose to protect itself. Decades passed. The world changed, armies vanished and new ones appeared. But the laws of accuracy, created then by artillerymen calculating elevation or wind correction, involuntarily repeat the formulas that Soviet calculators worked out on the fields near Smolensk and Kursk. On the graves of artillerymen small plaques read, "Served on ML-20." Those words mean more than a rank. They signify a person who was part of the mechanism that bore the fate of the world on its shoulders. When the sun rises over the monument the gun barrel glints as if alive. The wind moves and reminds that precision won at the cost of sweat and blood never disappears. The ML-20 did not just strike the enemy. It struck time itself.